Welcome to Texas+Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. I'm Todd Votteler, your host. I'm also Editor-in-Chief of Texas+Water and the Texas+Water Journal. Both of those publications are free, and you can find them at texas+water.org and texaswaterjournal.org. Today is a special day. I have as my guest Emily Lewis, a shareholder and the co-chair of the Natural Resources Practice Group, Clyde Snow in Salt Lake City, Utah. Emily is also an adjunct professor of law at the University of Utah, but maybe most important of all, she is the host of the Ripple Effect podcast, which she had me on as a guest about a month or two ago, which I really enjoyed, and I was just chomping at the bit to have you on my show. And so, Emily, welcome.
Todd, I'm so excited to be here. It's so fun to be on the other side of the microphone.
I think it's easier.
Yeah, I hope so. But no, I love your podcast, and I love the little community of people that we're creating out here in the internet ether, listening to fun things about water. So I really appreciate being on here, and I'm very excited to join you.
Well, thank you for taking time out to do this, and I've been looking forward to it. And so let's kind of start out with, how you first became involved with water. When you were young, when did you start really focusing on water, or was it older like in college or something?
Yeah, my journey to water, I think, has just kind of been implicit, honestly, just in my experience to date. So I'm very fortunate in that I grew up in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. My parents were early ski bums in the 1970s who moved there, and my mom worked at the hospital. My dad ended up having a mill work for many, many years, making a custom log flooring and doors, and I just was fortunate to grow up in an environment that was very rich in natural resources. And so from a very early age, we were big into river rafting. There's a great Class 3 section of whitewater right outside town that, I grew up on the oars. And so just from a personal kind of recreational perspective, I spent a lot of time on the water growing up. And then throughout kind of high school, post-high school, college, and actually all the way up through the middle of law school, I was a multi-day raft guide on the Salmon River up in Idaho, as well as kind of dabbling in some Idahos here in Utah, or some rivers here in Utah. And so, being on the water and kind of watching the water levels rise and fall, depending on whether or not we were below a dam or in a free-flowing section, was really interesting to me. It was really interesting to me where we'd float the headwaters of the salmon on the main salmon or the middle fork, and the water would taste so clear and clean. And then you get down to Hell's Canyon on the Snake, which is the salmon runs into, and the water, you could taste all the nitrates in it physically. You'd be like, this went through a huge agricultural section of Idaho, didn't it? And so that kind of visceral experience just got me really interested in doing this more professionally. And so I actually went to law school with the intention of doing natural resources and more particularly water law. And, I really only applied to Western programs typically that had a strong water law program. And so that was kind of my impetus for going to law school. And then I've just been extremely fortunate to, really from the get-go of day one of my legal career, basically be in natural resources and more specifically water for about the last 10 years.
What a great combination. You don't meet that many people who have that kind of intimate knowledge of the resource and experience with it, which you combine with your career in law. And that, I imagine, just makes you that much more effective in things that you do.
Yeah, I think one thing I love about water is everyone has an interesting and intimate story to it, and, in my recent career as a private law, I worked for the state of Utah for about 5 years at the Utah Attorney General's office, 3 of those representing the Utah State Engineer. And then for about the last 7 years, I've been in private practice. And one of the things I love is just everyone has, if you're in this field, it's something that you know and deal with intimately and from a bunch of different perspectives. And so, mine's kind of from a personal recreation recreational background, but, I love talking to people about, I love talking to producers. They're some of my favorites. Like whenever we have meetings, I love talking to people on tractors and talking to, water users from that perspective. And I love talking to the engineers and I love talking to the technical people. And it just is an infinitely fascinating field.
Great. Well, let's kind of dive right into it, right? So you just can't get away from reading something about the Colorado River, not the Texas Colorado River, but the Colorado River out west, that big one. And I've heard, of course, so much about that issue from the perspective of the state of California and Nevada and Arizona. But I'm just curious, tell us, what is the Colorado River issue look like from kind of the perspective from Utah? Because Utah's not really tapped into the river in a major way, has it?
I love the opportunity to counteract that point.
Okay, because that's
perfect.
Well,
yeah.
That's great. If I'm wrong, I want to know.
Well, no, I do think, so just first of all, these are my personal opinions. We represent a number of clients at our firm, who do have Colorado River interests. So this is just kind of my, my opinion from working in the field and not representative of any of my clients or anything like that. But I do think that, the Colorado is a major topic of discussion here in the state of Utah, and increasingly so, over the last 2 years. As you mentioned, a lot of the California discourse, or a lot of the Colorado discourse, typically is about the lower basin states. Those are the states that developed first. Those are the states that are really, going to most be acutely, affected by shortages on the Colorado, in that they have a lot of development based on that, a pretty solid and stable water supply, which is becoming increasingly uncertain. For the upper basin states, it is a little bit different. And so Utah is a very interesting state to be in and work in, because, we do have Lake Powell, which is the large, reservoir that's right at the dividing line between the upper basin and the lower basin. And, we do have, 23% of the upper basin's Colorado River portion, so a fairly large amount. To date, we have not yet had a population that's demanded all that water, but we are in a place where we are increasing in our population. And so it's an interesting discussion about development. With climate change, we're seeing just dramatic real-time reductions in the amount of water available. So what I think is interesting, and something that I think is a good point of discourse kind of for the broader community to think about, is that in the last probably like 3 or 4 years, Utah has really taken a strong and kind of assertive stance in taking Colorado River issues more seriously, both at kind of a independent water provider level, but also at a state level, which I think is kind of cool. And so some of the things that we've done here in the state recently is we have created the Utah Colorado River Authority, which is a intrastate body. So it's got representatives from kind of all of the various, sub-basin tributaries in the Colorado Basin, as well as tribal representatives. We just added a tribal representative this year, and some burgeoning advisory boards. And so this was passed in 2021. So the authority kind of got set up about a year-ish ago, passed, and we kind of got it set up last summer, and it's just had its first couple meetings. But the purpose of the authority is to let Utah speak on the Upper Colorado River Commission with kind of a unified voice, and really kind of to ferret out a lot of the internal issues in the state about how we use and develop our Colorado River portion, what are our priorities, how is we as a state going to address coming issues of drought and climate change and resource development. And it's really an exciting development in a lot of ways because it's providing a forum to have a lot of discourse about a lot of complicated questions and really invite the experts in and the stakeholders in to get to some consensus on some complicated and oftentimes contentious questions.
So do you think, prior to that, was there any kind of a feeling, I guess, maybe in Utah that all the kind of maybe big future decisions about the river are in play, and there's a lot going on, and maybe, hey, this is a time when we need to become more unified and more active in determining what that future is going to be?
Yeah. And again, these are just my personal opinions from an outside perspective, but I think that, everywhere you look in water, things are changing. The last 5 years, I'm in my 12th year of my career, so kind of beginning of mid-career, I guess. I don't know where you put that. But I just think that water in the West, no matter if it's a Colorado question or a Great Salt Lake question, which I think we might talk about later today, it is just becoming more acute. All the questions are becoming more pointed because drought is real. And it's coming, and it's and more so just outside the immediate acute impacts of the drought we're in. I just think we're seeing that resiliency is needed because we're just going to have to do more with less, but also just do more with disruption, because the climate models also show there's going to be generally diminishing flows in the Colorado River Basin and also across the Wasatch Front, but 1 out of every 10 years might be a huge water year. It's also disruption. The real issue is not necessarily just drought, but dealing with a changed and changing ecosystem that doesn't provide the water supply in the same way that we've anticipated. All of our models need to change. All of our projections need to change. A lot of our management decisions, need to adapt. We here in the state of Utah, and I love this, I have to tell people this. I do teach at the law school. I'm the adjunct law professor. And one of the things I love about Utah is, water planning is like in the DNA of the state. Like, we've never been asleep at the wheel when it comes to water. There's this great 1903 irrigation survey by Elroy Mead that comes in, and it talks about the, Salt Lake Valley and the Utah Lake Valley, and how, the Mormon pioneer trains who came in and developed the valley were just prescient in terms of water development, and how we've had this, incredibly robust irrigation system that's built on this kind of communal concept of, water shares and water companies that really, struck Elroy Mead as very different and distinct from other irrigation surveys he had done in the West. And so here in Utah, water development and planning has been, since day one. Brigham Young came here, and we have our there's this, the July 24th is the day that they celebrate the founding of the Salt Lake Valley. But I was doing some water rights work for Salt Lake City, which has a pretty large water rights portfolio. And there's a July 23rd water right of when the exploratory party first came into the Salt Lake Valley and stuck their shovel down in City Creek. And so it's kind of a long-winded answer, but I think that, in terms of your immediate question of, our attentions to the Colorado recently, Utah has always been thinking about water. I just think the conditions have changed and that our conversation and our focus has changed.
So tell me if this is close to the mark or not. When I look at many of the other Western states, there is a substantial history of interstate, water management and work with the federal government through these big water projects and large rights associated with them. And Texas is a bit different, except for the Rio Grande. Most of the rivers are pretty much within the boundaries of the state. We do have compacts with some states, but the majority of the water supply is really internal to the state. And so state water law, state water policy is what has driven everything. There aren't any federal water rights here. Mm-hmm. And so I look at Utah and I kind of think, it seems like maybe that situation may be somewhat more similar to Utah than some of the other Western states, because many of your water resources, it looks like, might, be from, watersheds within the state that you're not sharing all that water. But I may be wrong about that, because I don't know all that much about the hydrology of Utah, but I know that with the Colorado issue, that's quite a bit different than what I just described. And so I'm just kind of curious about that, if the history has been more of a, intrastate, management of water, now becoming more of an interstate management system.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair view from an outside perspective. But Utah actually is kind of subject to two interstate compacts, and then we also have some interstate groundwater issues with Nevada. But we'll talk about the Colorado in a second, because that's a fascinating story on its own. But outside and independent of our interest in the Colorado River Compact, Utah is also subject to the Bear River Compact, and so the Bear starts up in the high Uinta Mountains in the northeastern part of Utah. It runs north into Wyoming, the best state, through past Evanston, Wyoming, and then kind of tucks back up into Utah, and then goes into Idaho. So it's a three-party compact, and then goes past Bear Lake, which is actually not hydrologically connected to the Bear River, but has been connected through man-made means and is a key component of the Bear River system. It holds a lot of storage water. And then the Bear runs through Utah and then exits at the Great Salt Lake. So, yeah. So and the Bear River is actually, our firm is fortunate to represent a couple large interests on the Bear River, and we've got 1909, 1912, 1859, like some pretty old water rights on the Bear, and so it's pretty fascinating in terms of just kind of how the priority system works in an interstate model. So we've been dealing with that for, over a century for sure. And then in terms of the Colorado River, Utah, was the recipient of the Central Utah Project, kind of back in the 1950s. And so, that gave a large injection of federal money to build several large federal projects here in the state of Utah. And that under the Central Utah Project, we actually bring over Colorado River water into the Wasatch Front to where it's not historically native. And so we do have a fair amount of our water along the Wasatch Front is Colorado River water and is a transbasin diversion. And so, those are kind of our two major interstate bodies of water. And then we don't need to go in this today because it is its own animal. But, in the last 15 years or so, we've had increasing focus on and conversations with Nevada regarding the interstate aquifer that sits between Nevada and Utah. So, we have a lot going on in terms of our water resources. We're also, and this should be noted right up front, the second driest state in the nation. So we have, pretty limited water resources. So second driest state in the nation, we have a population of about 3 million people right now. It is one of the fastest growing economies in the country. And by 2065, we're anticipated to have over 6 million people here. So it is literally a doubling of our population on diminishing water resources.
So Nevada's the driest state, is that right?
Nevada's the driest, yeah. We kind of like to poke each other about which one's actually the driest, but
I don't think I would like to be the one who claims the winner of that one be the driest state. But let me just ask quickly, the name of that water, that aquifer that you share with Nevada, what's that?
It's a Snake Valley Aquifer.
Snake Valley Aquifer.
Yeah,
okay.
And there's been a bunch of efforts to pump and pipe groundwater down to the population centers, and they've gone up and back and forth between the Nevada Supreme Court several times. And I think we're at a point where those activities are presently stayed. So.
Gotcha. Well, any predictions, kind of thoughts about where you think the Colorado issue is going among the Western states? What you think might ultimately happen here in the next few years? I'm just kind of curious if something.
Yeah, I mean, again, these are outside personal perspectives. These aren't representations on any clients, but, the S.J. Quinney College of Law, my alma mater and where I teach at, had a fantastic Colorado River Symposium in mid-March this year. And it was great. We had a lot of voices from the different states come, and I think the conversation is realistically going to be one of shared sacrifice. And so there are some very complicated questions coming down the pipe, so to say, at the state. But one of the things that I found very heartening is, one, I think that, Utah's always had wonderful water professionals, but, I think that the state has put a lot of time and resources and money into Colorado River issues in the last couple of years, which I think is going to produce a lot of really productive dialogue, a lot of really productive science, a lot of really productive kind of, collaborative solution making that hopefully, we can share with our sister states. So I think that it's funny, maybe because I have the podcast and I'm a chatty Cathy and I put myself out there, but I get a lot of calls from journalists to talk about, Colorado River stuff. And it's funny, or just water in general. And they always want to go to, what's the fight going to look like? And I was like, hopefully nothing. Hopefully there isn't a fight. Hopefully that's not where we spend our energy. Because, the projections are predicting a hotter, drier future. And there's just not a lot of time and bandwidth to put our energy into fighting. And so one of the things I find very heartening is, while there can still be, disagreements or dialogue that, about complicated questions, it seems to me from an outside perspective that there is a sincere interest amongst the states to come together and really find some solutions, like the DROA agreement and then the 500 plus agreement. There's been a bunch of agreements recently that have been pretty innovative, sacrifice sharing documents amongst the parties.
Yeah. I think collaboration is much more common over these issues in the West than I think the public generally realizes. I mean, there are a lot of instances where there's no collaboration at the moment. People are really duking it out in court or legislatures or someplace else, but in many other disputes over water, conflicts over water, there is a lot of discussion and dialogue and shared sacrifice, like you say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And creativity. I mean, lots of creativity, though. That's a fun thing. I think that we're entering this really new age of really interesting science and really interesting solutions and just some really creative sharing agreements. And it's not a field for boring. It's not a boring field.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There are a lot more options on how to come up with a solution that works today than they used to be 30 years ago, for sure. So with that, let's go ahead and switch to the Great Salt Lake. And so, I wanted to mention there is this really, and I'm sure you know all about this really fascinating landscape art, on the edge of the Great Salt Lake that I had read about in a magazine, and then I flew over it and saw it. It's almost like a spiral. The spiral jetty, Smithson,
yeah.
Right. Yep. That's, it's above water and then it's underwater, and I saw that and I thought, wow, that's really cool. And that was several years ago, and I know that the level of the lake has changed quite a bit since then. And so let's talk a little bit about the Great Salt Lake and some of the issues that it faces, and maybe just you could start what's the trend for the lake over the last several years?
Yeah, definitely. So the Great Salt Lake, for those of you who, in the Texas listenership or, who may not be as familiar, is an internationally important water body. So it is one of a few saline lakes, that is a key to critical migratory paths for migratory birds. It is a nesting ground for the thousands and thousands, like millions of birds, like not joking. And not to plug my own podcast by any means, but if you want to listen about Great Salt Lake stuff, I've got 4 or 5 very, very good Great Salt Lake podcasts about specific elements through Westminster Institute and Audubon Society, who have worked on Great Salt Lake issues. But it is also something that people don't realize is the largest producer of brine shrimp. And so brine shrimp is they're sea monkeys, basically. They're sea monkeys. But brine shrimp is a critical food source for farmed fishing. So if you get farmed fish from anywhere in Southeast Asia, it's probably based on Great Salt Lake brine shrimp. So it is both a critically important water body for migratory birds, but it's also a huge economic driver for brine shrimp. We also have a ton of evaporative mining processes on the lake. The lake is so saline. It's like, I don't know the exact specific, but I think it's like 10 times saltier than the ocean. And so we have these very large evaporative operations on the north end of the lake that produce sulfate of potash, which is an organic fertilizer and dust suppressant. And so it's also like a huge driver for kind of the mining economy here in the state of Utah as well, which is fascinating. Can I tell you just a really interesting story real quickly about that? Like an aside.
Sure.
So the Great Salt Lake, so we have all these mining operations out on the north end of the Great Salt Lake, and basically what they do is they basically have these diked ponds, and then they like get a saline solution that basically gets denser and denser and denser through each pond. And then because it's so corrosive out there, you can't pipe that. And so what the producers out there have done is they created this thing called the Barron's Trench, where they basically have dredged a trench across the entire north arm of the Great Salt Lake. And I'm talking, this is like miles and miles, like 20 miles maybe, I don't know, like huge amounts of space. And they let that super saline brine flow through that trench. And because it's more viscous and more dense than the salt water above it, it flows by gravity under the other water and goes to their processing plant. Like it's like,
oh, gotcha.
It's like a whole nother world out there. And it's all pink. It's all pink. And so if you guys ever watch Ghostbusters 2, when I like teach this in my law school class, I say, it's like the pink slime under New York, pretty much.
Do you know what the total dissolved solids are for that? I mean, is it? I mean, how many? It's got to be
crazy. I mean, like the lake itself is like 10 times saltier than the sea. So I mean, like whatever that brine is,
it's about 350,000.
Like that. I don't have the science on it, but it's real salty. It's real salty.
So that's, you can be 350 parts per thousand,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, a big number. A big number.
35.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's so just that's the context for those who don't live in Utah. Everyone focuses on the Colorado, but the Great Salt Lake is also a key critical body here in the state. And so what's interesting about that is that inflows to the Great Salt Lake come from a couple places. So we have basically 3 inflows. We've got those from the Bear River, which I mentioned earlier, and that's also kind of the breadbasket of Utah. So a lot of our agricultural producers do pull water off the Bear. The Jordan River, which comes from Utah Lake, and then kind of the the west side of the Wasatch Mountains, so kind of the Wasatch Front. Also, though, through the Jordan, because we do have those trans-basin diversions through the Central Utah Project, Colorado River water can end up in the Great Salt Lake through the Jordan. So it's also, I like to talk about Utah as like one big sweater, where if we pull something, things kind of come up. And then Farmington Bay is the other freshwater source. So last summer, the lake has seen, after record levels in the early 1980s, like literal flooding down the streets of Salt Lake City. Since then, the lake has been in pretty steady decline, and we have reached the lowest point of lake elevations ever last summer. So it is a critically endangered water body. And so
what would the first year be that record keeping?
ever, like tree rings that like they've gone back, but like since recording,
Okay.
I mean, this is the lowest the lake has ever been, because the Great Salt Lake is also the remnant of what it was Lake Bonneville, which was this huge lake that like covered most of Utah and parts of Nevada. But I mean, definitely since recording, but I think the scientists think that this is the lowest lake level the lowest level it's ever been. So we're kind of starting to talk a little bit into Owens Lake issues. So, the problem with the Great Salt Lake is that
with dust.
The dust. Yeah. It's a very shallow lake. So declining lake levels literally expose hundreds of miles of open playa. And so being a citizen here in Salt Lake City, immediately adjacent to our Great Salt Lake, dust is becoming a legitimate issue, not just from a public health concern, because it's also like arsenic-laden dust from all the weird salts. But what happens is that dust lands on our snowpack and just accelerates the melt cycle. And so it's also having some pretty dramatic impacts on our water cycle. So the Great Salt Lake, in a lot of ways, the Colorado is important for sure, but in a lot of ways, the Great Salt Lake is kind of the defining water issue of our time, because it's so intricately related to so many other things.
Well, what is the state of Utah doing with regard to that? Is there a plan in place? Are you putting one together now? What's the situation?
I have to say, I think that, I hate to say it, but the drought brings people together. I mean, the Great Salt Lake's been in decline for quite some time, but it hasn't really gotten outside, kind of some academic circles and some water professional circles who've realized it's, the relevancy for quite some time. But in the public eye, it really hasn't gotten the attention it should until the last 2 or 3 years. And luckily, I would say that attention has garnered some really positive activities. The 2022 legislative session was just a boon for the lake. So what we did is we had a couple different bills passed. Actually, even before passing the bills, on January 5th, I believe, of this year, the Speaker of the House, Brad Wilson, held a half-day seminar just on the lake for all the legislators. So basically, he was rallying his troops to say, this is a public priority. We would like to address it. There's been 4 or 5 years of good reports telling us what we should do. And actually, our firm was fortunate enough to drafted in 2020 a document called Legal Strategies for the Great Salt Lake that talks about some water law considerations for bringing water to the lake. Our report, in combination with another report called the HRC 10 report, laid out a pretty clear path for kind of what could be next steps, and along with additional documentation. But those 2 reports are pretty key, and that led to some pretty proactive legislation. So what we had is we've kind of got 3 or 4 bills. One of them is HB 33, which is an adjustment to our in-stream flow bill that allows, prior to the change this year, our in-stream flow bill was very, very restrictive. Like, only certain people could hold them. It could only be between a reach where there's no intervening diverter. It got the most junior priority in the system, which basically means you don't get water anyway for your purpose. And what we did is we took away all those restrictions, and basically anyone can file for an in-stream flow change application as long as it's related to the mission of a couple of our state agencies, which are lake-related and elsewise. So that's a real key right there, is we've kind of opened up some ability to kind of legally shepherd water to the lake for purposes. The other thing we did is HB 410, which is we created a $40 million trust for the lake. And that trust is going to get set up this summer. And it's going to be operated by 2 nonprofits to be determined. And the reason that we chose to have the trust operated by a nonprofit is to leverage private capital, whereas the state's not as able to do that so quickly. And so the trust will work pretty hand in hand with our state agencies, but the goal is to purchase, buy, and lease water for the lake. And so $40 million is just a drop in the bucket. It's not really going to get us where we need to go, but it's at least a start to kind of start the engines on things. And then we also appropriated another $5 million to do kind of what we think will become a Great Salt Lake Integrated Management Study Plan. So the state really did put some resources behind addressing this issue. those are fantastic efforts. That being said, it's a big problem, and it's we're dealing with decades of drip the wrong direction, and so I think that we're not going to immediately see shining waters on the shores of the Great Salt Lake next year, but I think we're starting to really understand its importance and its impact, and kind of put some tools in place.
So it sounds like you've modified your in-stream flow provisions for surface water rights so that environmental flows, can be, guaranteed in some way. And there's some money for, I guess, purchasing some rights.
Purchasing or leasing. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Right. You can use that new system. And did you hint, or maybe you didn't, that there was also some discussion about importing sources, or am I making that up?
No, just saying that just the way that the state's plumbed, since we have that transbasin diversion through the Central Utah project that brings water up and over. It's actually fascinating. We kind of collect it up in our Strawberry, our Stillwater Dam, and then kind of bring it up and over through these big tunnels at Diamond Fork to the Wasatch Front. That Colorado River water, import water, can get stored in Utah Lake, which is to the south of the Great Salt Lake, but connected to the Jordan River. And then, Jordan River flows can actually go into the Great Salt Lake. So there is a transbasin diversion element of this as well. So really Utah is, water management in Utah is thinking about and kind of balancing a big chessboard, not just a small chessboard, because it's like, if we can reduce demand on the Wasatch Front, that means less imported water, which means water can stay on the Colorado River side, which means that we have to, could potentially deal with Great Salt Lake stuff just with Wasatch Front native water. So it's a very complicated state with a lot of big plumbing.
Sounds like it. Yeah. Sounds like it. Well, let's kind of start to come to our final question here, and that is about your water banking program. It's something that we discussed on your podcast, but I'd like to discuss a little bit on this podcast. And you've got a program which is modeled, I guess, somewhat after what Washington State and Oregon have done, and it's more or less, and it's a 2-track program. You want to talk about it a little bit? Yeah.
As kind of one of the many efforts that the state of Utah has taken in recent times to, develop some tools for water users, I think there's this kind of like public narrative that like Utah is asleep at the wheel, which is so funny to me because maybe I'm like too biased and like too in it to like think that. But we have been kind of going blazing and guns out here for the last little bit on a bunch of different projects. We've got an ag optimization task force that's been doing a ton with like on-farm improvements and management for ag water. We've got really, while we're not Las Vegas, because Las Vegas has been doing this for 20 years, really making gains on our municipal use and reductions in our municipal use. We had our first, no turf bill on state land, state properties this year, et cetera. And then one of the other things we've done is in starting about 2017, we really kind of started a stakeholder working group to discuss, water banking, quote unquote, but water banking, as you and I know, Todd, means many things to many people.
Right.
But what we did is, we really wanted to start an effort that says, what does water banking mean for the state of Utah? And so we kind of did a internal assessment of, what was already happening here in the state of Utah, like what kind of leasing activity was happening, what kind of sharing activities were happening, were there any water auctions going on, kind of what kind of water transactions were presently occurring in the state. And then from that, we then moved on to looking at what other states had done. Idaho to the north of us has a very, very robust banking program through the Idaho Board of Water Resources. And we didn't actually model it after the state of Washington, but we've come up kind of like with a program that is like eerily similar to Washington kind of on our own, which I think is actually kind of exciting. And so what we kind of came up with is we really wanted to here in the state of Utah give more tools to local water users. And so we wanted to create more opportunities for water users to address some market barriers that they were currently seeing that were prohibiting water leasing. And so from the very get-go, we decided that the 3 words that we were going to focus on were voluntary, temporary, and local. So this was not local, being this was not going to be a top-down government program. It's going to have to come up from the water users. Temporary in that we really wanted to keep, water rights with the water right owners. We really wanted to, avoid buy and dry. And then voluntary, like you only do it if you want to do it, And so what we've kind of created is what we call this kind of like laboratory of democracy banking principle. And so we drafted some legislation and had it passed in 2020. And really what the legislation does is it provides some, additional tools for those water users who are interested in entering a lease arrangement for their water. We gave them some tools that they had identified as something that they were looking for. So basically, and I'll talk about the 2 tracks here in just a second, but if you establish a leasing arrangement that works for you at the local levels, and there's 2 ways you can do that, which we'll talk about that. Basically, you can apply to have that leasing arrangement be approved as a water bank to our Board of Water Resources. The Board of Water Resources conducts a completeness review, so they don't take any substantive judgment on what you've done. I mean, you could literally have like a bulletin board, or you could have like an auction, or you could have something that works for the local water users. And as long as the local water users agree, the board is like, cool, good, go for it. And we do have some protections in there to make sure that the arrangement takes care of, how they're going to wind down if they decide not to continue, how they're going to like keep track of water, et cetera. And then once the leasing arrangement is approved to be a water bank by the Board of Water Resources, it's extended certain benefits. Like we have kind of like a streamlined administrative process for changing water rights to be in the bank. It's kind of a one-time process. And then once they're in the bank, they can move around freely. Water rights in the bank are protected from forfeiture. And that was to kind of encourage, areas where there's urban land transitions or like rural to urban land transitions. All those irrigation companies who might be physically losing their place of use can have a way to preserve their water right. And we also said any water right that's approved to be in a water bank can be used for environmental purposes. And as we talked earlier, Todd, we just changed our in-stream flow statute. And so prior to that 2022 change, the water banking statute was kind of like the most flexible way to use a water right for in-stream flow purposes. So that's kind of the goal. The goal is to say, we want to encourage you to do water transactions. We want to keep money in the local communities. We want to encourage you guys to find something that works for you. Every water bank in the state is going to look different, but they have the central premise of it's local water users coming together, finding a transaction that works for them. And so, we also, to kind of give some sideboards, recognize kind of 2 models of leasing transactions that can be used. One is called a contract water bank. And essentially it's a contract, just being like, I, party A, lease water to you, party B. Like, it's pretty simple. And you could have a couple people involved in that leasing contract. For example, our pilot project has an irrigation company that's going to fallow land and lease shares to some local nonprofits. So that's one. And the only caveat with that is that you have to have a public entity involved. And that's just so that we can kind of graft onto the public notice requirements. We want to make sure that private speculators couldn't make a contract and, get the forfeiture protections that they, would want. So that just kind of recognizes that leasing's occurred, for a very long time. And we just wanted to give water users an opportunity to transition their leasing into a bank. The second path is through what's called the statutory water bank. And that's intended to be kind of more like a middleman, like a turnkey transaction where it's like, I have water, I don't know what to do with it, I'm going to give it to the bank. The bank's going to take care of finding someone to lease it out. I don't have water, I want water, I don't know anyone to get it from, I go to the bank and try and get water. So like it's a legal entity organized for the purpose of leasing water. So So that's kind of the premise of the statute. And then, as you and I talked about in our podcast, I sit as the Utah Water Banking Program Manager. And so we've got a three to four, we've asked for an extension due to some COVID delays, year project with about $800,000 of funding to do 3 or 4 pilot projects, kind of testing these principles here in the state of Utah. And we are right now wrapping up about 3 of our pilots and are kind of starting up a new 4th one that we were able to add in because we came in under budget. So, yeah, that was long-winded. Sorry, Todd.
No, it's not. It wasn't. In a couple of years, I mean, you and I are going to be talking, before that, I'm sure, but in a couple of years, we should kind of revisit to see that program, to see, what it's accomplished.
Yep.
After operating for, I guess, 2020 is when it started? Yeah,
2020. And then realistically, we are not going to run any water under our pilots in the 2022 season. We got one bank set up, and we're in the middle of the change application process right now. So we've gotten the banking application done and approved, and now we're trying to move the water rights through our traditional administrative process. Kind of the way the banks are set up is they have a service area, kind of like an irrigation company has a service area or a municipality has a service area. And, you can kind of move the water anywhere within that service area according to the bank's principles. Like you still have to monitor it. You can't have double dipping. The bank is still responsible for making sure that water is used appropriately. But anywhere within that area, you have flexibility to move it. And so right now, in our Price area pilot bank, we're at the change application process. Our second pilot project, the Cache Valley area, actually chose not to become a water bank. And that's okay, because actually we call it the Water Banking Project, but the official title is the Statewide Water Marketing Strategy Report. And so we're also looking at, banking is one tool and the tool we're going to use to ask the questions, but it could very well be that just a private lease between 2 people makes the most sense, and that is relevant data. We want to encourage that. And so our Cache Valley pilot project actually ended up just being a private lease between 2 of the parties that we originally started talking with. We kind of initiated conversations with 5 or 6 parties thinking that we were going to have this kind of like integrated program between a bunch of irrigation companies. And then that just, after asking a series of questions, there just wasn't the demand to merit building a bank. And so 2 of the parties were like, well, I've got late season storage water and you need it. So we kind of created this leasing pool. And then the third pilot project is up in Snyderville Basin. And that pilot project is one where the new HB 33 bill with the in-stream flows has really changed the discussion. And we might just look as like doing a private lease because we don't need to set up a water bank now to get some of the benefits that we originally wanted. So that's interesting. And then our fourth project that we're just kind of about a month and a half in really looking at, critically, is a groundwater bank for agricultural purposes. And that's going to be done in Iron County. So, yeah, I mean, every day is fascinating. Every day is something new.
Well, that's great.
Yeah,
that's great. Not that many people could say that they've got a job that presents a new and interesting question every day.
Oh, dude, I feel like I have too many new interesting questions. Some days I'm like, I should just do insurance defense. Jeez, it's so much simpler.
Yeah, but not as exciting.
No, not at all. I would last like a day in that job. Anyone listening who does insurance defense. Sorry about that.
I don't think they're probably not listening to this podcast. Yeah. So Emily, let's go ahead and wrap up. And why don't you tell us though first, how can you describe the conference you had at the law school recently? Tell us how we can find materials from that, or if you have a recording associated with some of the discussion. Is there any way our listeners might be able to access that? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, so the Utah we love to put our stuff out there. So S.J. Quinney College of Law was the host institution, and inside the College of Law, we have a program called the Stegner Center, and the Stegner Center is the natural resources related program. And so if you just Google Stegner Center, University of Utah, you will find most likely recordings of the entire conference and materials. But they also do monthly brown bags on various topics. And so if you want, if you want to do like there's some like specific ones on kind of like Powell pipeline development, and there's other ones on like the Great Salt Lake. So like there's a lot more there than just the Colorado River Conference. Another place I have people check out is if they are interested in Great Salt Lake items. The Great Salt Lake Institute at Westminster College also has a ton of materials, so they're really, really good. And the Utah Division of Natural Resources has a pretty active and robust YouTube channel, so they also have a lot of materials out there for lectures they hold. And then also, not to be shameless, I typically try and pick podcast topics for my podcast, Ripple Effect, that come up in my work. So we've had a lot of discussions about Colorado River stuff recently. We had a really good one with Jason Robinson a little while ago now, and a lot of really good Great Salt Lake ones. We've had a lot about the Ag Optimization Committee here in the state. And so if you're interested in Utah, the podcast itself is much broader than just Utah, but we do talk about a lot of Utah items on that podcast.
Well, that was actually my final question for you. How do they find the Ripple Effect? Do they go to Apple Podcasts or SoundCloud, or what do you suggest?
Wherever you get your podcast streaming done, it's there. But that's what I love about it. It's like, it's such a great forum. I mean, we met through the podcast, and it's just such a great way to, like, especially during COVID, the early parts of COVID, to reach out and talk to your colleagues, and just really learn what people are doing. And there's so much activity in the water space right now. There's so much activity. And so it's fun to reach out and talk to people and see what they're doing. And if anybody has an idea that they want to talk about too, it's an open forum. So
Great. Well, Emily, thank you for being a guest on Talk+Water.
Well, Todd, I love being here. Thank you so much for having me. It's I love your podcast. You produce great work. I love the conversations that we're having. And so, I'm just excited to kind of see what happens in the next year. And we'll definitely be in touch about water banking stuff. But sure we'll be seeing each other around the internets.
I bet we will. Yep, I do look forward to talking to you again, especially after some of my water markets research is matured a little bit. So great. Well, this has been Talk+Water, and my guest today was Emily Lewis, a shareholder and co-chair of the Natural Resource Practice Group with Clyde Snow in Salt Lake City, Utah. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in, and to say that if you liked this episode of Talk+Water, please let us know by giving it a like. My name's Todd Votteler. Let's talk water again soon.